Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world, produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, May 31st. This week, we start with the unavoidable story of Donald Trump being convicted on all 31 counts by a jury of his peers in New York. How will the world react to a convicted felon being one of the two leading candidates for election of the president of the United States? And then we'll take a look at Ukraine. President Biden approved the use of U.S. weapons supplied to Ukraine to hit targets inside Russia that are threatening and attacking the Kharkiv region of Ukraine. This has been a long sought change in policy, but it is still limited in application. So, are Ukraine's hands now really untied? And if so, how will this change and affect the course of the war? Then this morning, Israel announced that its troops had reached the center of Rafah, raising buildings as it was tanks were starting to go into the center of the city. This follows the killing of dozens of refugees on Sunday when a blast, even outside the declared war zone, killed 45 people or more in a fire. So has Israel now crossed President Biden's red line? And if so, what will Biden do? And if not, where is this line? Finally, European Union members are heading to the polls this week in order to elect a new EU parliament. And while that is happening, it looks like the far right is surging throughout much of the member countries. What does the rise of the far right mean for politics in Europe, and what will its potential victory mean for the European Union? Here to talk about these issues are three reporters that cover these stories. Prashant Rao is senior editor at Semaphore. Anna Sauerbrey is foreign editor at Die Zeit, and Peter Spiegel is U.S. managing editor at the Financial Times. Good morning, afternoon, all wonderful to see you. Let's just start with the inevitable, the unavoidable, the only thing that people are talking about. And let me tell you, I'm in Cyprus. It's all they're talking about. It is not any soccer game or any basketball game. That was earlier in the week when we were in Greece. It's the conviction of Donald Trump in a court in New York. Guilty of 34 counts. Less important, because I think that's for lots of other people to look at, is what do you think the world's reaction is? And Anna, let me start with you. You are in Germany. I was speaking with the president of Cyprus earlier today, and he said, "Well, of course, this is now going to be the Republican candidate." And I said, "Well, it's going to be Donald Trump." He said, "Well, how do you mean if a convicted felon can actually run for president of the United States?" I said, "Yeah, he can even be in jail and he can be president of the United States." How are people in Germany reacting to this?
Well, pretty much the same, I
Anna.
would say. Yes, Germany reacted pretty much the same, I think. We woke up this morning to the headlines, and the news site Der Spiegel had the good idea, and I wish my newspaper would have had the same idea of putting 34 times the word guilty as a headline. They had this massive headline just saying guilty, guilty, guilty. And we saw an immense uptake in reader interest this morning on our website too. So this is really something that people have been very interested in and that they wanted to have explained. So the first analysis here, of course, or the first questions that we've seen from our readers was, well, what's happening now? And all we could tell them was what you just told us here too. Well, he can still be president.
Still be president. Prashant, you're in London. Don't know what the headlines there. There's a major election, of course, underway in the UK, not a European Union election, its own election, but still. The news of a president of the United States convicted of 34 crimes running for president must be seen as something that, not the weirdest book you couldn't read.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, Britain, I imagine all of you have spent a lot of time here. Britain has a real familiarity with American politics, and yet at the same time is sort of somewhat always surprised by what happens in the United States, just because this, I mean, who could predict something like this? It sort of cast my mind back to a great piece in the FT last week by Jenna Ganesh, just about how Britain's Conservative Party has just misunderstood long-term trends in the United States for a long time, just from a viewpoint of trade, narrowly. But it just speaks to that point of like, here in London, we watch the United States obsessively, and as I imagine everywhere else in the world does, and it still has the capacity to surprise. This time in, perhaps not the best way, but certainly I'm not sure anyone really was prepared for what this meant and what this means.
Peter, what you're in New York, so
yeah, People's Republic of Brooklyn. You want the reaction from the People's Republic of Brooklyn here? Is that
well, I was actually thinking you'd be at the courthouse right now, reporting. But you're also working for that English newspaper, the Financial Times. Your personal reaction, but also just sort of how you think people are starting to read it, including, how's your newsroom back in London looking at this?
Well, let me make the broader point, which I'm actually trying to write something about this today, which I think I've been trying to write for frankly 8 years, which is as Prashant and Anne will no doubt agree with me, is that this Joe Nye concept of soft power is an ephemeral thing, right? It is not about the size of the U.S. economy or really the size of the U.S. military. It is America as a model and as an ideal that in many ways influences foreign governments and foreign powers to either go along with what Americans want to do or at least take it into consideration when they're trying to model their foreign policies. And what Trump has consistently done is discredited that soft power abroad and the American as a model. And so having a Republican candidate who is a felon just further degrades that American exceptionalism. And I think we underestimate the extent to which the rise of the Chinese model as an alternative, or the more authoritarian model as an alternative, is in lockstep with the rise of Trump. Because, when you see a president of the United States stand up and say to the South Koreans, for instance, that we're not protecting you because we think it's in the interest of democracy and a matter of principle. It's a transactional issue which we want to make money off of it. The concept of an American, as a principled actor in the world is consistently degraded. And I think this conviction just contributes to that. The idea of the U.S. and its soft power and its ability to influence and serve as a model for other either emerging democracies or frankly even advanced democracies is degraded. And I just remember very distinctly, I was living in the UK shortly after the Clinton impeachment. And I remember there were just countries after country to country looked at the U.S. and said, if America can bring its president to toe with impeachment, we can do that too. And a whole bunch of other countries started impeaching their leaders who were in many cases actually corrupt. And I just think people forget that America as a model is in many ways the most important soft power that the U.S. has. And the extent to which Trump has degraded that over 8 years, and that yesterday's verdict contributes to that degradation, particularly since he's going to be not only the nominee of the Republican Party, but in many ways could be the next president of the United States, just further degrades the U.S.'s ability to serve as that soft power in the world.
I think that's a smart. I hope if you haven't written it, I hope you're writing it.
I'm working on it
because it is it's a good piece. I've been thinking slightly differently, which is that if Trump gets elected, that people will react. This is just not the same United States, and that people thought about, and the smart power brings that home. This concept that America is a power, the power of its example, rather than, as Biden likes to say, the example of its power, is what drives so many people. And Anna, I'd love to sort of get your final thought on that. What does this tell you about the United States? What do Germans waking up, seeing Der Spiegel headline, which wasn't in Die Zeit, but I'm sure your headline was pretty impressive too. Think about, so what happened to this country that we used to look up to? Is that part of the issue that one now sees?
I think it's right. It is part of how Germans see the US, and there might be a decline of America's soft power. I particularly see it in the younger generation, because you have to remember that Trump's been around for almost 10 years now, if you count his first campaign. And many younger people, like my teenage kid, he doesn't know America without Donald Trump. So that's how he sees it. At the same time, I think today's also a good day for how American soft power performance, because it shows that American courts can deal with this problem. And we've had a lot of coverage on this trial and on all the other trials here in Germany, and we keep trying to explain it to our readers. And I think there was a moment for me of pessimism earlier this year when we saw the both of the trials, who are actually the most important trials, which are about what he did on January 6th and trying to steal the election from the American people, how his lawyers managed to just push it further and further back and to hinder it and to bring it to the Supreme Court. And we don't know how they're going to decide and whether the Supreme Court is still neutral because it's packed with his judges. And I think now this was a very swift trial. It was portrayed here as in the United States as a trial that was very clear, that had a lot of good evidence, that had picked its jury in a very thorough way. So I think it was also a good day for American democracy and the American judiciary.
I would also just say,
very
Ivo,
important point. Yeah.
If I could jump in, I don't want to sort of downplay the importance of what's happened, but I think we should also just calibrate that, the person who defeated Donald Trump is currently in the White House. And, U.S. support for Israel right now is undergoing a huge critique. So it is not as though the world holds the United States in extremely high regard for its current policies, let alone, the potential that a convicted felon will become president. And then, to go prior to Trump, again, I think it's just a degree of nuance to where the world was pre-Trump as well. I covered the Iraq War. This was not a war that the United States was terribly popular for. And the latter stages of the Afghan war, there are plenty of parts of the world that hold the United States in some degree of disregard for abandoning them. India has a very sort of off and on, certainly an improving relationship now, but there are large parts of the foreign policy and elite that are relatively conservative in their views towards the United States. Pakistan holds, fairly, anti-American views. And this Israel war, I think, is really reshaping how the United States is viewed around the world on a bipartisan basis. And so I don't mean to suggest this is not an enormous moment. I just don't want to make it seem that the only reason, the U.S. is perhaps falling in disregard around the world is because of Trump. There are Democrat presidents as well as Republican presidents prior to him and after him who have conducted policies that the world does not hold in high regard as well.
Yep, Prashant, I think the difference I would argue is, again, I also covered the Iraq War. It was in Europe when Bush was president, and as an American during the war when Bush was president, it was an unpleasant experience. You get shouted at bars and stuff like that. But you can date back to fights in Germany over the MX missile and fights with between Carter and Berlin over détente and whatnot. But those were policy disagreements over American foreign policy. It was not that the U.S. was a sort of a power that was falling apart and immoral and was sort of there's a order of magnitude difference, I think, between a normal foreign policy dispute that even can get pretty vicious at times, including anti-American protests and frankly, even the bit of the world you're in now, the CIA station chief in Athens was assassinated over some of these policy differences. It could get violent. This is, I think, a different thing altogether, in which that the American system of democracy is being called into question because of the most important office in the land is going to potentially be occupied by a convicted felon. That would be where I would draw my distinction between.
Yeah, I don't mean to disagree with that. And again, I don't disagree with the points that were made earlier. I just want to sort of calibrate where the world sees the United States as a broader leader in the way it conducts itself in the world. I think it's worth just placing it in the broader context of that. But I agree with exactly everything you said.
I think that's true. And just to echo, I think, Anna's last point, because I think it's important. The system worked, and it worked in the way it's supposed to work, and that is, and rightly, we've been asking the question: how well is the system working? In this case, it was a jury of your peers, which was something that is in the Constitution, in which 12 people selected by the process that were selected listened to the evidence and came to a conclusion. in 10 hours of debate. They spent more time talking and thinking about it than anyone else, and came to that conclusion unanimously. And that is a good thing as well. So I think everyone's point is it's a complicated world out there. We'll have plenty of time to get back to it, but I did think that we had to highlight this discussion, and I think the comments we just heard from everyone just highlights how important it is. But let's, Peter, shift to Ukraine. Sort of big news, not so big news, who knows, news on really a drumbeat of voices in Europe and then in the United States, moving in the direction of saying, tying Ukrainian hands behind their back by saying you can have the weapons, but you can't use them against the people who are shooting at you, was kind of a difficult policy to maintain. And we saw the German chancellor moving. We saw, of course, the French president moving. The Brits had already moved on this a few weeks earlier, and now the president moving as well. Although the question is how much and to what extent, and what does it really mean? So help us understand what happened, and then what does that, where does that take us, and what does it do for the war writ large?
Well, that's exactly the point I wanted to emphasize, Eva, because you mentioned this in your setup, which it does appear that the shift is incredibly begrudging, A, and B, very limited. How it happened was literally the events in Kharkiv over the last coming weeks, in which it looks like the second largest city in Ukraine was about to be overtaken by Russian troops. We had appeals by Zelensky to various world leaders, including Tony Blinken, who was in the region, who took the issue to the president. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, also took it to the president after getting an appeal. And in what appears to be in this limited case where we have Russians firing on a city that's very close to the border, they said, okay, you can now use American-made weapons, American-supplied weapons, to fire into Russia, but if and only if you can identify a location where the strike came into the region. Now, look, this is not necessarily outside the norms of military behavior. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Iraq. Every time they order an airstrike, there's a military lawyer standing beside them, judging yay or nay on whether this target is legal or not. So what the Biden administration is saying is, as long as it complies with international law, it's fine. We don't want you to use these new ATACMS we gave you, these long-range missiles, to just randomly strike inside Russia, particularly oil sites. And also, more unnervingly, there's some evidence the Ukrainians have been attacking early warning systems for the nuclear forces in Russia, which gets the Americans very, very nervous. But I think this is take a step back, and I think this is what you were getting at, Evo, is this is of an order that has been going on now for about 2 years, right? Initially, there was a debate about whether even to send lethal aid, and then, okay, lethal aid, but limited lethal aid. We're not going to send tanks. And no, we're not going to send tanks, or now we're going to send tanks, but we're not going to send long range missiles. And gradually, like the proverbial frog in the boiling water, the administration has gotten to a point where they're now saying, okay, long range missiles, okay, you can strike inside Russia. And the question is whether that incrementalism is too little, too late. Whether if they had done this in the beginning, whether we'd be in a different place now. Now, to defend the administration, we now know ex post facto that all of Putin's threats and saber rattling on use of nuclear weapons and attacks on non-Ukrainian targets is basically hot air, that he's not going to do it. Although there's going to come a point where we are going to reach a red line and he may do it. So I wouldn't rule that out entirely. But I think in defense of the administration, hindsight is 2020. And I'm not sure we knew it at the time. And there was, as we know from the Prigozhin episode, there was at a time a real threat to Putin's regime over this war. And I think we know Putin well enough now to know that he will do anything to stay in power. And so I don't think the caution that sometimes is pointed at Jake Sullivan in particular, that the White House has taken, should necessarily be criticized as deeply as it has been. I mean, I've talked to a lot of retired military in particular who are really frustrated and actually very angry about the slow pace that the administration has come around on this one. I'm not sure those criticisms are fair, but I do think it's worth asking. Had we gone full, unleashing the Ukrainian military from an earlier point, whether we'd be actually in the position we are now, which is Russians on the offensive, Ukrainians on the back foot, in need of weapons, in need of supplies, and in need of being unshackled. And I think that's a fair question that we in the media and frankly critical administration should be asking.
No, I think you asked and put this exactly in the right context, including that it's easy to be sitting in CNN and making the arguments, but when you're in the White House or in the Chancellery, as indeed Olaf Scholz, having debated these issues as well, having to make the decisions and live with the consequences of those decisions, it's a little more difficult. Anna, I was struck by the person who has shared President Biden's caution, of course, has been the Chancellor Scholz. And yet we saw him move in the last couple of days after a meeting. I guess it was a joint cabinet meeting between the French and German cabinets, which in itself is, I always find it remarkable that these things are happening, and what other two countries have cabinet meetings together on a regular basis as France and Germany have. But after that,
we have it with the Chinese too.
You have it with the Chinese too. Oh my God, maybe
Yeah.
it's just a German thing then. Obviously, that surprises me. The French one I thought was a good thing. I'm not. Well, a strategic dialogue with other countries is a good thing too. So that's true. But what was your reporting on why Scholz decided that it was time for him to say it's okay to target Russian troops and planes and capabilities that are attacking inside Ukraine? And does that mean there might also be a move on that other thing that Germany has been asked to do, which is to provide the longer-range Taurus missiles?
Well, on your first point, Scholz hasn't really shared his thinking on why he's moving now, so I can just guess from what we are observing. And I think it's really that German military who cooperate closely with the Ukrainians are not panicked, but really worried about the situation and what it's like especially in the Kharkiv region right now, the city being constantly attacked. I've just today spoken to our correspondent who's in the city right now, who's been out to the house that has been damaged in night strikes with 4 people dead and several other injured. So we are observing this here very closely, and the German government is observing it really closely. And I suppose that they have just seen that further steps are needed. And then there's, of course, Scholz, who's always vowed to be in lockstep with particularly the Biden administration, as well as other European countries. And I would guess, without knowing, that there have been intense conversations with the US administration before Scholz started to move. And then there was a certain pressure that Macron did put on the German government when he visited Berlin and put the option on the table. And that made Scholz move rhetorically, and for a couple of days he kept us guessing what he really meant. We've already been joking that he has also taken a crash course on strategic ambiguity when Macron was here in Berlin, because for a couple of days he kept saying, well, we know that in international law it's not forbidden to strike an aggressor country when you're the defending country. But today we've had the confirmation that they have really moved on this position. And I think we have to give him credit for that, in particular because he's on the campaign trail. He's on the campaign trail for the European elections. We also have regional elections this fall in the East, where we see a lot more skepticism towards this war than in Germany overall. And he has been campaigning on big terms like prudence and caution, and has still decided to go this move now. So I think they really think this is needed.
Can I ask you just to go back to the Macron issue? Because I think, at least from Washington, some of the eye-opening shifts has been mostly in Paris rather than Berlin, because you had for a year and a half sort of the Balts, the Poles, and to a certain extent the Brits, who were the hardliners, and the French in many ways were much more equivocal and whatnot. And suddenly, almost overnight, Macron became the most vocal, talking about even at one point saying French troops in Ukraine is not off the table. Now, not only is Macron going through the same European elections that Scholz is, but obviously he has his own national elections going on. So some of this may be election year politicking. But I'm just curious, as there's a view in Berlin about what has changed in Paris and why Macron has become such a hardliner on this, and out in front of Biden in particular over the last 2 or 3 months, and what's behind that, and what the reaction has been in Berlin to that.
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with Macron's thought or the thought in the other day, but we certainly observed that there has been a major policy shift in France too. And I think Macron was, or that's how people who know more about it than I do in Germany portray it, like our correspondent, he has still believed that talking to the Russians could be useful, that the lines have to be kept open, both for the purpose of de-escalating tense situations, possibly during this war, but also in keeping in touch with the Russians about, well, maybe getting them to refrain from escalating and to move them towards talks with Ukraine at some point. But I think at the Élysée, they have come to the conclusion too that this leads to nothing. And I remember that there was one last call between the Russian defense minister and the French defense minister, a phone call that parts of which the Russians made public in a very distorted way. And I think that this might have been a tipping point where the French just saw it's no use. They're just using us for their own propaganda. If we talk to them, let's take on a different policy.
Prashant, how is all this seen from the UK? Clearly, the British moved on this issue a few weeks ago already. They were certainly the first ones to say, listen, if they need to strike into Ukraine with our long-range missiles, they should do so. So no block there. My sense is that there's a policy that is widely supported, including by the current opposition, leading Labour. But how is it generally seen, and how are they looking at sort of Biden's late conversion, Scholz's late conversion, and Macron, who I think, as Peter rightly said, really has sung from a very different hymn book than he did, about a year ago.
First off, Ivo, you're right. I think we are entering an election campaign July 4th. Brits will be going to the polls. But among the many things that the Conservatives and Labour disagree on, one thing that they, I think, largely overlap on is support for Ukraine militarily, security, foreign policy. Those are, largely aligned with maybe minor differences on the edges here and there. I think, on the Macron point, the things that sort of people who are watching France here in London will often say is as well, you can't discount the domestic politics that he is undergoing. Peter alluded to this a little bit as well. Everybody's in election season, but Marine Le Pen and the National Rally's kind of strong polling suggests that, Macron's legacy might be a risk, and there's not really a kind of clear successor to his presidency. And so I think there is real worry in the Élysée, or at least that's the sort of thought here in London, that a post-Macron presidency will not be as willing to deal with the Russians in the way that Macron would prefer. And so there is a real risk that, this war has to be won or be on the track to be closer to being won than it is currently. And I think that might partly explain. I mean, as with all these things, we're not there, but I think, there's elements of, as Anna put it, but also I think there is an element of domestic politics and polling that is certainly at play. I think there, when it comes to Biden, I think in a lot of parts of Europe, there is some frustration about the slow pace of conversion in the White House. At the same time, I think, Peter's points are exactly right. Like, it's very easy to sort of suggest that, what if we had done this and what if we had done that? But I have a lot of sort of appreciation and sympathy for the calculation that, I mean, if we are to correctly interpret Vladimir Putin as in the kind of Western security architecture, an irrational actor who also has an enormous pile of nuclear weapons and, how he will behave when he is threatened, I think that is a reasonable thing to guard against and to, raise support for Ukraine in slow, methodical ways. I think there is a rationality to that I appreciate both in retrospect and in the moment. And it's hard to be actually the person making that decision. That I think it is very easy, as you say, to sit on CNN or on this podcast or any other number of the media that we will all be in and say, well, this war would have been over in 6 months, 9 months had just the Americans done all the things they have done in one fell swoop. But I mean, it's never that easy. We all know that. And we should just be, I think, a little bit, all of us should be just a little circumspect about the choices that are being made in the moment.
I think that's certainly true. Although to be fair, some of the people who are critics have been arguing that this should have been done from day one, and they're not just looking back. They were willing to take the risk earlier, but they didn't have to suffer the same consequences. I just on Macron, I mean, I was a critic on thought that he was grandstanding a lot. I'm now convinced, talking to people who've talked to him quite a bit. He's very genuine. He's very, very, very worried that this war is going very badly. And as he says, it's now an existential problem for France, for Europe, if Russia wins, and it cannot be allowed to win. And I think, by the way, we'll come back to this, no doubt, in the weeks ahead. But in the run up to the NATO summit, this is going to be the issue. Are we doing enough to make sure that Russia does not win this war? And we just this week found out that the consensus was, no, we're not doing enough. We need to do more. And we'll find out whether more will be necessary then too. But that's for another time. Prashant, let's move on to the really pressing issue of Rafah. As I said on the outset, Israeli troops are now in the middle of town. They're with tanks and large numbers of equipment. If this is not a operational invasion of Rafah, I don't know what is. And as President Biden made very clear in the beginning of April, if they're going to do this, the U.S. is going to say no. And yet the White House keeps saying, not quite there yet, not quite there yet. At what point does Israel reach the red line, or is that line pink?
That's a great way to phrase it. I think it's really hard to tell. I mean, what's happening right now, as you sort of neatly summarize, is these Israeli forces are now in the center of Rafah. A U.S.-built port, a floating port that was supposed to deliver aid, has largely crumbled, which has been basically a sort of both symbolic and tangible sort of sign of the kind of failed humanitarian operation to get much needed aid into parts of Gaza where, people are desperately in need, and humanitarian officials regularly sound the alarm about hunger, impending famine, etc. Whereas earlier in the war, Benjamin Netanyahu looked like any potential sign of an election would immediately lead to his downfall. That is no longer necessarily the case. His Likud party is rising in the polls. Benny Gantz, his war cabinet, a fellow war cabinet member, has sort of threatened the dissolution of parliament for new elections, which Netanyahu will not necessarily lose, which, in prior months would have seemed like a shoo-in. And increasingly, the political picture in Israel is complex too. I say this all as context to say that this war is not going the way I think the White House had anticipated. To say the least, it's a much darker version of what was thought to be happening. And there's no end in sight. This week, an Israeli National Security Council official talked about how it could go on for several more months, certainly through the course of this year, which is another 7 months, which would be, we've already gone through 7 months of this so far. I think it's going to be pretty hard. Given the domestic politics of the United States and the sort of nature of kind of where certain voting groups are aligned, I think it's going to be pretty tough for the White House to actually impose its red line on Israel. And yet it is caught in something of a vice grip, in something of a catch-22 rather, in that if it doesn't, then it has Arab American support very much at risk with regards to the continued sort of bear hug of Netanyahu's government.
I think, Prashant, that's exactly right. And Anna, I think of all countries, aside from the United States, Germany has been the most supportive of Israel. But both the operation in Rafah and, of course, the humanitarian situation inside Gaza are at large. And importantly, the legal, international legal maneuvering, first of the ICC, although the warrants, I think, haven't been approved yet. But I think importantly, the International Court of Justice ruling that the operation in Rafah needs to stop has led the German government to say that, international law is important. It needs to be adhered to. What is the mood in the government and on the street on the question of the continuation of these operations with all the consequences that we've been seeing over now many, many months?
Yeah, I think the war has put the German government in a very difficult situation because it is trapped between its dedication to what we call the Staatsräson of the raison d'etat of Germany to protect the state of Israel and support it in its existence. And other foreign policy principles that Germany has held very high, like humanitarian aid and international law, the protection of international law, is especially when it also comes to the courts, the ICC and the ICJ, both of which Germany has supported very much financially and through politics since the beginning, other than, for example, the United States of America. And I think they're still trapped in there in those dilemmas, and that what we see in the reactions to the offensive in Rafah and the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and also the issuance of or the request by Khan to issue an arrest warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu. So the German government is still pretending as if those two things, that's how they try to dissolve the dilemma, are divorced from each other, as if what is happening in Gaza and the humanitarian situation is one thing and the Israeli government is another thing, and they just don't bring it together. So they are criticizing and increasingly loud, in a loud way, criticizing what is happening there, especially the foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, who's calling for humanitarian relief. But they still refrain from naming the Israeli government as being at the heart of it, or being an important factor, besides, of course, Hamas, why people in Gaza are suffering so much. And I think this doesn't really work anymore. And in particular, it doesn't really work with the arrest warrant if it's really issued by the ICC, because the ICC is naming the people they deem responsible for this, and this is Netanyahu and Gallant.
Look, I think Netanyahu, I think, is
Peter, it seems.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Peter, no, to go ahead. I mean, I think the U.S., I think what Anna's describing in the German government is exactly the same bind that the Biden administration finds itself in, plus the politics of it.
Well, this was exactly the point I was going to make. I mean, I think there are two almost fatal mistakes that Netanyahu is making right now. One is a military, strategic, tactical, however you want to phrase it. What did we learn from Iraq? You cannot go into a country or a region and say, we're just going to kill all the terrorists. They don't wear badges, apparently. I mean, I don't know why, but apparently they don't identify themselves. Hi, I'm with Hamas, and you can go shoot them. You end up killing civilians. It's exactly what happened to us in the Sunni Triangle. It's exactly what happened in various parts of Iraq. And the fact of the matter is, you end up creating more terrorists than you kill. And it wasn't until Petraeus became commander in Iraq that we realized that and changed tactics. And Netanyahu has not changed tactics. He is not going to win this war through brute strength. But more importantly, this tactical error is, and again, you get and I guess this point with Germany, but it's the same thing in Washington, is support of allies is just as existential for the future prosperity and existence of the Israeli state as defeating Hamas is. It has long been the most important foreign policy goal of the Israeli prime minister to ensure bipartisan support in Washington for Israeli statehood. And he's blown that. He has blown that. The Democratic Party, probably for the rest of our lifetimes, is now going to be either divided or wholly against the existence of the state of Israel, at least as long as Netanyahu's prime minister. I mean, you have not only do you have the far left of the party, you have Chuck Schumer on the floor of the Senate. You have, and Ivo, you were the Obama administration, so you know this firsthand. I mean, the amount of visceral hatred for Netanyahu amongst really sort of moderate foreign policy types within the Biden-Obama world is just palatable. I mean, he is so angered his most important ally that he's making a crucial strategic mistake. Israel cannot survive and prosper without alliances in Berlin and Washington, and he's blown both of them. And so I cannot figure out, other than the more cynical reason, which is once he loses office, he's going to be prosecuted by the state attorney general in Israel. I cannot see where he sees the end game here. He's not going to win militarily. He's not going to win diplomatically. Why is he doing this? And I think he's made two fundamental mistakes that he's not going to be able to recover from.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with both of those, and certainly that, it was Joe Biden who on October 17th told him, don't make the mistakes we made in Iraq. And he's made it over and over and over and over again, including the biggest mistake, which frankly, we never recovered from, despite Petraeus and everything else, was not to think through who governs the country once you have removed the leadership. And that's the post-Gaza piece is, you cannot fight a war if you don't know what the outcome is going to be politically. it's sort of Clausewitz 101, that war is a continuation of politics by other means, and the counterinsurgency campaign also failed in taking that piece. But I think politically, you're absolutely right, and I think I want to marry Prashant's earlier point at the very beginning when we were talking about Trump on this. Not only has he made it really difficult for the allies, he's made it really difficult for the United States. The United States is suffering deeply around the world, as Prashant, I think, rightly mentioned, by being tied into this war. And that, in fact, has political repercussions in the Democratic Party, et cetera. But it's also got really big political repercussions for the United States and its ability to do what it needs to do in the world, which is so problematic. So, we talk about this issue every week on World Review, and it's remarkable how little learning there is on the part of many in the Israeli government as we look at it. I know we're running out of time, but I do want to just jump into the last issue, the rise of the far right, and Anna. We won't know the results, and I sort of predicted the results with saying that the far right was doing really well in the opinion polls. It's doing slightly less well in Germany than it was before. So, but it is remarkable that if you talk to European politicians all over, the idea that there is a sea change in politics in Europe. Some places it isn't. Certainly, places like Britain, it's moving in the opposite direction. But as a Dutchman, I'm looking at the new government in the Netherlands. It's with a man who got a third of the vote and is even more popular now than then. As usual in these governments, when you don't govern, you really become popular. It's when you govern that things go the wrong way. But Anna, help us understand what is happening in Europe, and what do you think the immediate consequences are for the Union?
Yeah, I think you've used the term sea change, and that's how it has been described, at least since the beginning of the year, since the media here and some citizens started to think about this elections, and of course the party started to think about the elections, because we expect both of the right-wing extremist caucuses in the European Parliament to gain seats on a major scale, and also major gains in important countries like France for the right-wing parties there, like the Rassemblement National. So it feels like a sea change, and that's of course how the right-wing parties are framing it. It's the end of the center-left Europe, the pro climate policy, pro Ukraine. In a way, you can't say Europe was really pro-migration in the past years, because they have already introduced, even under the center-left and conservative Commission and Parliament, very harsh restrictions on migration. But on the first two, they certainly see themselves in the coming. And on looking at from the center-left perspective, it feels like a doomsday moment. But I think what we saw in the past 2 weeks adds a little salt here to this narrative, because we see that it will be very hard for the far right to sort out who is building a coalition with whom, and who would support who as the president of the Commission. The AfD has been excluded from its caucus by Marine Le Pen. It's deemed too extreme now, with the scandals hovering over its two major candidates, and they will have to form a new coalition. And of course, this is connected to the question who's going to be the next Commission president. And Germany, for example, is one important country also in the Council who gets a big say on deciding this, has warned Ursula von der Leyen of forming or having herself elected in the European Parliament with the voices of the most extreme right caucus in this parliament. So I think there's a lot for the far right to sort out after this election, and how much power they will gain also over climate policy, over Russia policy, will only be clear in I'd say at least a month or two when all the hassle in Brussels has been sorted.
Yes, I mean, it's the great parlor game of predicting what will happen, or to talk about, as we are, about all the things that may happen on the basis of the fact that people haven't even gone to the polls yet. We don't even know what's going to happen in the election. Peter, this is your old stomping ground. I know you live and die for this stuff. Any thought on sort of what it means to have a much larger representation of the far right, divided it may be in the European Parliament, as you think about European politics in the second half of the year and going forward?
It's always struck me, and this is not obviously the first European election where we're going to have a rather sizable far right. I'm pretty sure it's still the case that Front National is the largest single party inside the European Parliament. So this has been going on for some time now. The thing I always find ironic is that Brussels in particular, and those who are involved in what they always call the European project, have always tried to turn issues into pan-European issues, right? We should not be fighting the European elections on national issues, and although they are never on national issues. And now we do have pan-European parties, and they happen to be anti-European parties. The only pan-European issue is anti-Europe. And that is the irony of all this, in that the only unity seems to be that these parties don't like Europe. And I think that is maybe the tragic irony of these elections, is that they have created a unified pan-European view, but the pan-European view is anti-Europe, which is genuinely a tragedy.
Prashant, is one reason things in Britain are so normal is because they no longer have to worry about pan-European issues?
Yeah, things are perfectly normal here. Nothing to see. Move on. One of the things that is actually that has struck me is, I think as the far right has grown in its prominence, we have seen, exactly as Anna said, these kinds of fractures within the group, and it is worth sort of thinking about that. I think, like, Peter's of course right that they agree on the biggest thing that they agree on, which is that they all hate the same person, the same grouping. But it is striking how different Giorgia Meloni is from the AfD on these issues. And it took these comments from the AfD's candidates to outline that these are not sort of small policy issues. They have actually quite radically different beliefs about who was good and who was bad in the last 70 years of history. And that is quite an elemental difference.
Note to German politicians, probably shouldn't say nice things about the SS. That in general is, even in this day and age, probably an election killer.
Bit of a vote loser, at least among your allies in the European Parliament. But it is quite striking to think about it that way as well. I think the differences are more remarkable than I think we all first assumed.
Yeah, no, I think emphasizing that point that Anna made about let's not assume that just because they're far right, they're all the same. And in fact, those differences may well come to play, and it's partly Waffen SS and what have you, but it's partly because there are real differences. There are still pro Ukraine, anti-Russian far right, including in Meloni. The Dutch government has a coalition agreement, is extremely pro-Ukraine. Which is surprising, but it's there. So we can't assume that it's all doom and gloom. And that's the good news. The good news is we can come back and look at it again next week and see how it goes. I want to thank Prashant Rao of Semaphore, Anna Sauerbrey of Die Zeit, and Peter Spiegel of the Financial Times for a really excellent, insightful, even at sometimes mildly optimistic view about where we are. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a great weekend.